Imagine two companies that deeply despise each other, and yet cannot survive without one another. Two giants locked in the most expensive war in the history of technology. More than 50 lawsuits across 20 countries, billions of dollars on the line, and a rivalry so fierce, it literally rewrote the rules of the global smartphone market. One sells a dream, the other sells volume. One controls everything, the other dominates everywhere. But here's what most people never talk about. Before they became sworn enemies, Apple and Samsung were trusted partners. And it is precisely that betrayal, real or perceived, that ignited everything. Together, these two companies still accounted for roughly 40% of every smartphone sold on the planet as recently as 2024. And the story of how they got there is one of ambition, arrogance, broken trust, and a war that nobody truly won. This is not just a story about patents or money. This is a story about ego, about what happens when two of the most powerful companies in the world stop respecting boundaries, about how a friendship built over decades can collapse in a matter of months. This is the story of Apple and Samsung. And like every great war, it started with an alliance. The year is 1983. Samsung is still primarily known as a semiconductor manufacturer out of South Korea. Apple, on the other hand, is a young and hungry company in the middle of redefining personal computing with the Macintosh. Steve Jobs, Apple's co-founder, and Lee Byung-chul, Samsung's chairman, begin building a business relationship. Apple starts ordering electronic components from Samsung: chips, screens, memory. The two companies see each other as partners, not competitors. And at the time, that makes perfect sense. Over the next 2 decades, that relationship deepens into something truly extraordinary. Samsung becomes one of Apple's most critical suppliers, delivering billions of dollars worth of components every single year. Processors, display panels, flash memory. Apple depends on Samsung for the technological guts of its products. And Samsung depends on Apple for the kind of revenue that fuels its own ambitions. It is a symbiotic relationship. Almost perfect. But like every relationship that looks too clean on the surface, it is hiding a tension that is slowly building underneath. On January 9th, 2007, Steve Jobs walks onto a stage in San Francisco and pulls a small rectangle of glass and aluminum from his pocket. Today, Apple reinvents the phone. That day, the world changes. The iPhone is born. And with it begins a new era that neither Samsung nor anyone else in the industry was fully prepared for. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable. About a year before that historic launch, Samsung's new CEO, Lee Jae-yong, was personally invited to Apple's headquarters for a private demonstration of the iPhone by Jobs himself. It was a gesture of trust between longtime partners. But in 2009, barely 2 years after that private showing, Samsung released the Galaxy Rivalry, a smartphone running on Google's Android operating system. And at first glance, the resemblance to the iPhone was striking enough to make people stop and stare. Steve Jobs was furious. He felt that Samsung had used that trusted relationship, that privileged access to Apple's vision, to copy his most important invention. In March 2010, Jobs reportedly told his biographer Walter Isaacson the following words, and these are real, documented words. "I will spend my last dying breath if I need to, and I will spend every penny of Apple's $40 billion in the bank to right this wrong. I'm going to destroy Android because it's a stolen product. I'm willing to go to thermonuclear war on this." That was not a figure of speech. That was a declaration of war. But before the lawyers took over, there was one last attempt at peace. In 2010, Apple approached Samsung with a licensing proposal. The deal was straightforward. Samsung would pay Apple up to $30 for every smartphone it sold, and up to $40 for every tablet. To understand how aggressive that demand was, consider this. Just a few months earlier, HTC had agreed to pay Microsoft $5 per Android device sold. Apple was asking for 6 times that amount. Samsung refused. The two companies did sit down for a meeting, but nothing came of it. The positions were too far apart, the egos too large, and the mistrust too deep to bridge. From that moment on, the legal machinery moved with a speed and scale that the tech industry had never seen before. On April 15, 2011, Apple filed a 38-page complaint with the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California in San Jose. The language in that filing was blunt and unforgiving. Apple accused Samsung of having slavishly copied the design and technology of the iPhone and the iPad. The comparisons Apple presented were hard to ignore. The rectangular shape with rounded corners, the app icons, the touch interface, the bounce back effect when you scroll past the edge of a page, the pinch to zoom gesture. Apple argued that every single one of these elements was its intellectual property, and that Samsung had taken them without permission. Samsung did not wait long to strike back. Within days, the Korean company launched its own legal counteroffensive, citing violations of its patents on 3G wireless communication technologies. And it immediately took the fight international, filing claims against Apple in South Korea, Japan, and Germany. What had started as a business dispute was transforming at breathtaking speed into the largest patent war in the history of the technology industry. By the end of 2011, Apple and Samsung were entangled in nearly 20 active lawsuits across 9 different countries. By mid-2012, that number had exploded to more than 50 cases in over 20 countries, with billions of dollars in claimed damages between them. The war was now global, and its outcomes were chaotic, contradictory, and impossible to predict from one courtroom to the next. In August 2011, a German court ordered a ban on the sale of the Samsung Galaxy Tab 10.1 across the entire European Union, ruling that it looked too much like the iPad. It was a thunderous early victory for Apple, but within days, the injunction was lifted everywhere in Europe except Germany, where it held. In the Netherlands, Samsung won. In Australia, there was a ban, then a lifted ban. In the United Kingdom, a judge infamously ruled that Samsung's tablets were not cool enough to be confused with Apple's iPad, and actually ordered Apple to post a public notice on its own website acknowledging that Samsung had not copied its design. Apple complied, but did so in a way that a court later deemed deliberately misleading, and was forced to redo the notice entirely. Meanwhile, the centerpiece trial was playing out in a San Jose courtroom, presided over by Judge Lucy Koh, who was managing 2 armies of lawyers from the 2 most powerful technology companies on Earth. The proceedings were tense, dramatic, and at times almost theatrical. At one point, after Apple's legal team submitted a 75-page brief introducing more than 20 new witnesses on the final day of arguments, Judge Koh reportedly asked them, "Are you smoking crack?" In August 2012, the American jury delivered its verdict. It was a devastating blow to Samsung. The jury found that Samsung had willfully infringed on Apple's design and utility patents, and ordered Samsung to pay $1,049 million in damages, the largest patent infringement jury award ever recorded in a design patent case. Samsung had violated Apple's patents on the bounce-back scrolling effect, on-screen navigation, tap to zoom, the rounded corner design of the smartphone, and the layout of app icons. It was a historic win for Apple on paper. But the story was far from over. Samsung immediately appealed. Judges reduced the damages. New trials were ordered. New lawsuits were filed. Samsung pushed back with its own telecommunications patents. Appellate courts reversed decisions. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office even invalidated some of Apple's core claims, including its pinch-to-zoom patent. Every victory for Apple led to a new battle. Every setback for Samsung led to a new counterattack. And here is what makes this story truly remarkable, something most people never stop to think about. While their lawyers were fighting each other in courtrooms on 4 different continents, Apple's and Samsung's engineers were still working together. Samsung was still manufacturing the processors that powered the iPhones. Samsung was still producing the OLED display panels that you're likely looking at right now if you own a modern iPhone. The 2 companies were simultaneously suing each other for billions of dollars, and doing billions of dollars of business with each other every year. This is what the business world calls being frenemies. Enemies who simply cannot afford to let the other one go. But there were darker revelations too. At one point during the American trial, it emerged that images Apple had submitted to the court, side-by-side comparisons of the iPhone 3GS and the Samsung Galaxy S, had been manipulated to make the two devices appear more similar than they actually were. Samsung accused Apple of deliberately tampering with evidence. And in December 2016, the United States Supreme Court stepped in. In a unanimous 8-0 decision, the justices reversed a lower court ruling that had awarded Apple hundreds of millions in damages, sending the case back to lower courts and fundamentally questioning how design patent damages should be calculated. It was a significant public setback for Apple's legal strategy. In 2018, after 7 years of litigation, Apple and Samsung finally reached a confidential out-of-court settlement in the United States. The financial terms were never made public. But here is the cold, uncomfortable truth. Nobody actually won this war. Apple secured headline-grabbing verdicts, but Samsung's products never left the shelves. Samsung kept selling hundreds of millions of smartphones every year. Consumers never stopped buying Galaxy devices. The courtroom wins did not translate into any real market advantage for Apple. Samsung paid damages, but those amounts, however staggering they sound to ordinary people, represented a fraction of the profits both companies generated during the same period. And both companies burned through hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees over 7 years to arrive at a final result that looked far more like a draw than a decisive victory. The war had consumed enormous resources, generated enormous headlines, and changed surprisingly little. Because the real war was never in the courtroom. The real war was always on the shelves, in the stores, in the pockets of billions of people around the world. And there, the numbers tell a story that is still unfolding. For more than a decade, Samsung dominated the global smartphone market in pure volume. From 2012 through most of 2023, Samsung held the title of the world's largest smartphone seller virtually without interruption. Over a 10-year span, Samsung shipped an astonishing 3.1 billion smartphones, 730 million more than Apple over the same period. That gap alone is larger than the entire population of North America. But the dynamics are shifting in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. In 2024, Apple and Samsung found themselves in an almost perfect dead heat, each capturing roughly 18% of the global smartphone market for the full year. Some research firms gave Apple a slight edge, reporting 232 million iPhones sold against 223 million Galaxy devices for Samsung. Others gave Samsung the lead. The margin was thin enough that no one could agree on a definitive winner. And heading into 2025, according to projections from Counterpoint Research, Apple is on track to reclaim the global #1 position in smartphone shipments for the first time since 2011, with an estimated 19.4% of the market compared to Samsung's projected 18.7%. In terms of revenue, the gap is even more striking. In 2024, Apple generated over $380 billion in total revenue, compared to an estimated $220 to $240 billion for Samsung across all of its divisions. Apple sells fewer devices, but at higher prices, and with margins that no competitor in the industry can match. Samsung has spent a decade trying to compete on every front. Budget phones, mid-range phones, flagship phones, foldable phones. Apple has stayed almost entirely in the premium tier and quietly grown its share of the market while generating more profit per device than anyone else in the business. So who is really winning this war? Samsung still leads over the past decade when you count total devices shipped. But Apple is winning on margins, on brand value, on customer loyalty, and now increasingly on volume as well. The iPhone user who buys an Apple Watch, subscribes to Apple Music, stores everything on iCloud, and upgrades their phone every 2 years is worth an entirely different kind of value to Apple than a Samsung customer who might switch to a cheaper Chinese brand next time around. And that is the threat neither Apple nor Samsung is talking about loudly enough right now. While these two titans have been fighting each other for 15 years, a third force has been rising quietly in the background. Chinese manufacturers, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, Transsion, are eating into market share in emerging economies with prices that neither Apple nor Samsung can match without fundamentally changing who they are. Xiaomi alone grew 15% in 2024, shipping 168 million devices and capturing 14% of the global market. Transsion, a brand that most Americans have never heard of, moved over 106 million units. The real question is no longer who wins between Apple and Samsung. The real question is, how long can these two giants hold the world before China takes it from both of them? If you want the full story of how Xiaomi went from a garage in Beijing to the third largest smartphone company on the planet in less than 15 years, comment below, type "I want part 2." Subscribe so you don't miss it, because in the next video, we're going deeper into the decisions, the strategies, and the moments that no one in Silicon Valley wants to talk about. And trust me, that story is darker than anything you heard today.